Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Demystifying Money. I'm joined today by Brad Baldridge, and we're going to talk today about the cost of college. So, Brad is a CFP who specializes in college planning, retirement, and other personal financial and family goals. He's also the chief blogger, podcaster, and college financial expert at Taming the High Cost of College. In addition to sharing his strategies and insights with thousands of parents across the country, he does help other families, with other, specific financial goals and dreams. So we do work in the same field, which is exciting, but Brad is definitely a college planning expert. So I wanted to speak with him today because I know I've talked to a lot of families who maybe are getting to the point where college is coming up soon and they're starting to worry a little bit about how they're going to pay for it, how they can make these decisions. And again, it is a lot different maybe than when they went to college. Or, maybe they want to make sure that their child has, a different experience, but the cost is really something that has become a huge factor for a lot of parents to think about. So thank you so much, Brad, today for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
This episode of Demystifying Money with Misty Lynch is proudly sponsored by Soundview Financial Advisors. Visit www.soundviewfinancialadvisors.com to learn more.
So I'd love to hear how you got your start and why this was the area that you decided to dive into deeply when it comes to all the other different types of financial planning with retirement, all the other things you could think about. Why was it education that stood out for you?
Well, it was a focus that I got a little bit of training in. And as I started talking about it, the more I realized that lots of families needed it and nobody really was talking about it. And once you dive into it a little bit, you realize, oh, there's strategies that work for these kind of situations. And there's these strategies over here. And there's lots of interesting things that you can do. But most people are completely unaware. And they're so far behind, typically, they're more likely in panic mode than in actually plan and prepare mode.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that that's something, it's like the holidays and stuff when people overspend and it comes every year, we know it's coming, but it always feels like a surprise and some panic. But, as a mom, my kids are 10 and 12, it feels far away, but then it also sometimes feels like it could be right around the corner, especially when I talk to people who have children in high school and college that tell me that it's going to go very quickly. So first question I have is for people who are just starting out, what are some, when it comes to the first step, when it comes to planning for college, what are some of the mistakes that people might make at this stage that could potentially save them time or stress or money if they were to, have a different strategy?
Right. So I think most people don't really understand the overall college process and the fact that, as an example, most colleges have a list price or cost of attendance that's published. And it's a big number. It's up to a little over 90,000 now per year for the most expensive colleges. And the average state school is about 28,000 right now. But again, that's cost of attendance. That's tuition, room and board, books, fees, beer, and pizza. It's the whole cost for 1 year for a student. But that's not what most people pay. They pay substantially less because of scholarships and grants and other financial aid. So because the net cost might be 10 or 15,000 for some families, and the net cost might be 50 or 60 for other families. So it really depends on your situation. It's kind of like when you go to the department store and you've got to play the game, right? You take that $50 shirt and you use the right credit card to pay for it, and you use your points and all your other gimmicks, and all of a sudden that $50 shirt is $20. College is very similar to that. And then, of course, you can always go to Walmart and that $20 shirt is $20.
Yeah.
So you have to decide, right? There's state schools where there is not a lot of gimmicks. They're just low cost to begin with. But especially the private schools, some schools will treat you better than others. And it's really understanding which ones are appropriate for you.
So I think when people are thinking about this timeline, like you mentioned, a lot of people get really, late stage, things are happening really quickly and they feel a little bit of panic and stress, which is usually when we don't make the best financial decisions. But what would you say would be the ideal timeline for college planning for anybody who has a child who may be considering college in the future?
Right. Well, there's two phases. The first phase is what I call early stage, which is, well, college is coming someday. And that's kind of a overall financial planning. Are you going to pay for a lot of education? Are you going to pay for some education? Are you just not interested? And that kind of helps you decide, well, should I be saving, investing, and preparing? But once you have a student in high school, then we switch over to what I call late stage college planning. And that's when, even if you have a big pile of money saved, you're not done. You've got a lot of work to do as far as
Mhm.
choosing the schools, getting your visits in, doing the research. The student needs to figure out what they want to be when they grow up. Parents need to understand need-based aid and merit aid and loans. And you got to put a budget together. Are you going to pay 20,000? Are you going to pay 50,000? Are you going to pay 90,000 at a crazy expensive school? Putting all that together should start in ideally sophomore year of high school,
Okay.
maybe even freshman year, um, and no later than junior year. Now
Mhm.
that's ideal. That's not reality for most
Mhm.
families. A lot of times families start later than they should. But if you take nothing away from this message, it's start early and really get involved. I've never ever had anyone tell me I started this too early,
That's
but I've
true.
had a whole lot of people tell me I started too late.
Yeah, I think that, and it's such an important decision. And a lot of times, it might be difficult. Some children might know what they want to do or have a good idea, and some might not have a clue yet. So I think that, it's really important to think about these and start these conversations and just to make sure that you're making a good investment because, like you said, this is a pretty big financial decision for parents and children. And so when we look at the budget and how much we can, I think if there's a certain limit, that might limit where we look. So, what are your thoughts when it comes to actually looking at, because a lot of times people might have their favorite school or their dream school without even really thinking about the cost, when it's such an important piece of it, especially for, if they're taking on substantial loans that they might have to pay for, what feels like the rest of their lives. So, what are some things that you think people should look at when it comes to actually, those college tours or putting that list together of schools?
Right. So a lot of people, think about college as like a return on investment. If
Mhm.
I go get this degree and I spend this much money, but I can make this much more in my salary for the rest of my life, and they do the math and say, okay, well, this makes sense. This is worth it. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I think there's a lot more to it than that for a lot of families where lots of parents that had a great time in college really want their kids to go off to college and have a great time too.
Mhm.
And it's not so much, well, this is how you're going to get a good job. I mean, it's part of it, and they hope that works out. But even if that didn't work out, they would be like, well, college was a fantastic part of my growing up, and I'd love to have that for my kids as well. And that's one of the reasons I think college is so expensive, is because
People
there's
pay.
parents that are willing to pay whatever it takes to have their students, go off and do what they would like. So
Yeah.
that, I think that's part of it. But then really looking at, that rate of return and is it worth it? It's really hard to quantify anything because there's not a lot of studies, there's not a lot of data. And lots of people say, well, the average student does this and the average engineer makes that and all that kind of stuff, which is mostly irrelevant because you're probably not average.
Right.
And now it gets more to, well, how does this really apply to us? There's
Yeah.
a segment of the population out there, where those kids are just going to be rock stars no matter what they do.
Mhm.
Right? They can go to college, they can skip college, they can become an entrepreneur. It doesn't matter. They're driven, they're likely to be successful.
Mhm.
Of course, there's a bunch of kids on the other end that,
Yep.
maybe college is not the right path for them. And maybe it needs to be the school of hard knocks for a while first, and then maybe things will change. I think where it can make the biggest difference is the ones that are in the middle,
Yeah.
right? You hear stories of, I went to college and this professor took me under my wing and changed my life.
Yeah.
You know, that's great. And that can happen at a college, an internship, at, apprentice, just work life, whatever it might be. So, but again, I think it's really finding a path. And I think that's where it gets challenging because most people's path is a little bit unique. And until you've seen 20 or 50 or 100 different plans,
Mhm.
it's hard to realize, well, which ones are similar. A lot of
Yeah.
people will say, well, my brother-in-law did this, so that should work. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
no, your
No.
brother-in-law's situation is so different than yours. It's not a good example.
Yeah,
And
I've definitely seen that where some people assume if you go to a particular college that like the six-figure salary will come. And I
right.
don't see that that's accurate, at least from my experience. I went to UConn. I lived in Connecticut. I went to Connecticut school, and used any loans and grants that I could get my hands on. And when I got my first job, I was sitting next to people who went to much more prestigious schools than I did, and we were doing the same job.
Hmm.
It wasn't exactly, it just mattered that we had a degree in that scenario. To be a CFP, I had to have a college degree, and that is still a stipulation that they had. The major wasn't so important, but it didn't seem to me, and I think that might be, is that a misconception that people have that if you go to, and this might not just mean like the Ivy League schools, but like uh, you know, for example, around here, the Boston colleges, the Boston, does that mean necessarily, or do people really have to think about, what the next step would be after with that degree?
Right. Well, on average, I would say yes. Well, again, that boils back to, well, on average, a lot of these more prestigious
Mhm.
schools have better outcomes, but also on average, they take the cream of the crop. So
Yeah.
is it because of the school or is it because they get to take all the
Mhm.
really strong students? And I would say the latter is much more likely. So they take a lot of really good, strong, successful, likely kids. They give them an average education, and it turns out that they're successful.
And they would be successful, likely, maybe any
Right.
path or different paths. So yeah, that is such an interesting point. But I think it's good to think about that. It's good to think about, is your child. And some people have said like, yeah, my kid will get a degree. School's not that important, not much of a focus, or, and that's okay too, because we're talking about at the time, 16, 17-year-olds that maybe don't know exactly what they want to do. And some are very much, off the bat high executive functioning, know exactly what they want to be doing. And so I think those are different kids. And it's important to think about, yeah, as parents, our feelings about our
Mhm.
experience and how that might not even be the same. Um, that won't be the same experience for your child either way because they're different people, but that it's maybe not the most important thing if
Right.
if you loved your school and want to recreate that for someone
Right.
else.
Well,
So,
exactly. But it's also another way to think about it, though, is, what can the family reasonably afford?
mhm,
And a lot of times there's a number of choices in that same price range.
mhm,
I can go to this state school for 25,000, or I can go to this private school for
mhm.
25,000. Now, this private school is 60,000. So maybe we'll take that one off the list. But in a lot of cases, there's multiple choices that will fit your path. Now, there are families out there where they're saying, well, we can only afford 5,000 for
Mhm.
college. In some situations, that's realistic based on the aid that you might qualify for.
Mhm.
But if you're not qualifying for need-based aid
Mhm.
and you think you're going to pay low amounts for college, that's where there's a bit of a rub where,
Yeah.
I've had families say, well, I paid for all of my college. My student's going to pay for all of their college.
Yeah.
Well, if that's a successful person that says that and they disqualify for most need-based aid, most students are not going to be able to raise 25,000 or 30,000 to go to even the low-cost state school.
Mhm.
So, I mean, the times definitely have changed where they've
Yeah.
kind of pushed it onto the parents, whether we like it or not.
And I see that in the other direction where some people are saying, well, my parents paid for all of my college. I want to do the same for my kid. And then we'll look
Right.
at their whole financial picture and show what that means as far as sacrificing things now to be able to do that. And a lot of times they're like, oh, because their parents were still able to fund their retirement. They were still able to afford a home and all of those and vacations and things like that and pay for their child to go to school because the numbers were just so different. So when it
Right.
comes to affordability, you mentioned how it's very different as far as the sticker price versus what people actually pay. Kind of like the rate that's posted on the back of the hotel room door is usually not what people are paying to stay in a hotel for a night. How do people figure that out? What are some resources and how can they really understand, what could be possible as they're kind of putting these lists together for schools?
Right. So I've got a great resource on my website at
Mhm.
tamingthehighcostofcollege.com. It's the cost of colleges by state. So we
Okay.
have a list of the various public schools and private schools in each state. And then we break it down by income. So, as an example, a public school might be net cost. If your income is 30,000, net cost might be 5,000. At 60,000, it might be 8,000. At 90,000, it might be 15,000. At 120,000, it might be full price or very close to full price.
Mhm.
Um, so all those resources are a great place to start as far as getting a ballpark idea. Again, it's averages and you're not average. So we got to take it all with a grain of salt. Um, because there's a lot of different extenuating circumstances beyond just what is your income and what school you're picking. But that's again, it gives you some numbers to work with where
Mhm.
college does not have to be crazy expensive, but it's very seldom going to be free either.
Right. So are there any, when it comes to financial aid, I think a lot of people have stories or ideas in their head. I won't qualify. It doesn't matter. I shouldn't even bother. What are some of those myths when it comes to financial aid that people should be aware of, that could potentially help them with these
Right.
costs?
Well, again, I think for a lot of families, it's assuming based on, a bad comparison. Let's say, well, my
Hmm.
brother-in-law did or didn't get aid, therefore I will or
I
won't get
won't.
aid.
Hmm.
Um, and unless your academics are similar for your students and your income is similar and your colleges are similar, it's probably not a fair comparison. And most of us don't have enough detail to actually,
Hmm.
know because most of us are not specifically, well, what exactly was your AGI when you filled out the FAFSA?
Right.
We're not having those kind of
Oh,
discussions
yeah.
and to figure out, a true fair comparison. So I think that's step one is understanding the process and understanding where you stand. But for a lot of families, I think it's really focusing on what schools will be a good fit for you. Because again, a lot of schools, their net price is dramatically different than their list price.
Hmm.
So it might be the elite privates. Stanford put out a press release a couple of years ago that said if your income is under $100,000, they will be free.
Hmm.
Zero tuition, zero room and board. Now, if your income's between 100 and 150,000, you'll pay some room and board, but tuition will still be free. And then from 150 on up, then it's a kind of a sliding scale where they could be very generous, at the $200,000 and $300,000 income ranges.
Hmm.
Now, the elite schools work a lot differently than the local state schools.
Right.
And the flagship state schools work a lot different than them. And
Hmm.
then you have schools like out of state public schools, like the ones that are in demand, UCLA and Berkeley and UVA and some of these top rated schools. If you're in the state, well, great, you get the nice in state price.
Hmm.
But if you're out of state, a lot of those state schools will be very pricey. UCLA is about 60,
Yeah.
65,000, something like that.
Hmm.
And generally, they expect out of state families to pay full price
Hmm.
because when they want to be generous and lower the price, they do it for the in-state kids, not the out-of-state kids. Again, and if you think about it politically, that makes sense, right? Where does their budget come from, et cetera? So they have to be, focused on the in-state families. So for some families, that UCLA at 60 still looks better than Stanford at 90.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a,
Hmm.
a discount. But for a lot of families, 60 versus our in-state school at 30, that's a pretty big price difference. And there's nothing wrong with spending 60 or 90,000. Some families, can afford it and that's what they want to spend their money on, right? Some families will have an expensive sports car or a lake home. Some families will pay more for education. There's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with it, but it's just understanding, how those pieces fit together for your particular situation.
I think that, yeah, that's definitely something to consider because a lot of times people will think, okay, I'm just going to have to go to public college because private will be more expensive. Where you mentioned they might have more flexibility. Might want a different, they might want different fields, different interests, and be willing to negotiate or offer a bigger package to a student that they want that meets
Right.
their, that kind of fills their needs as the school. So I think it's interesting to think of all those things. And I was somebody who did not have money when I was applying for colleges, which helped in some ways as far as the grants and things I was able to access. But I did do a lot of, I applied for a lot of scholarships and it was helpful. And I was able to get some that I didn't, didn't need to pay back, that, were different. So, and I talk to a lot of families now, and even I talk to a lot of people who have scholarships through their business that they've created, and they don't get a lot of traction or a lot of applications. So, what are your thoughts when it comes to scholarships, and any strategies that people can use if they're really trying to get creative about finding the money to go to maybe the particular school that they really want to go to, if that aid package doesn't completely fill the entire amount they need.
Right. Well, I guess to start with, scholarships is kind of a loaded
Hmm.
word, right? Scholarships, there's a lot of different types of
Yeah.
scholarships. So now, so I have the scholarship guide for busy parents on my website,
Hmm.
but first of all, there's scholarships from the colleges themselves.
Hmm.
And there's two or three different types there. And then there's the scholarships from other sources like
The small
foundations and
businesses, the
small
foundations. Yeah.
businesses, right?
Hmm.
All, at your high school, there might be local businesses that are, 1,000 here and 3,000 there, where mom and dad work and play. Your employer may have scholarships for employees' children.
Hmm.
Um, and then how's your student unique? Do they have a black belt in judo? Are they winning state competitions in ice skating? Are they deep into robotics? All those types of things may generate scholarship opportunities. Now, I've had some families say, well, let me tell you about my student. Right? He's on the football team, but he doesn't get a lot of playing time, but he does get in the game here and there. And he says he's in French club, but I never see him go. And he's pretty good at Xbox. Show me the scholarships.
Hmm.
And it's like, well, there are scholarships for that type of kid.
Hmm.
The challenge is there's also a million kids that are qualified for that scholarship because the bar's not real high.
Yeah.
So now it looks more like a lottery.
Hmm.
Then you have the high-end scholarship. Coca-Cola offers 250 awards of $20,000 each. That's a lot of money they're giving away. But they have 90,000 applications the last time I checked for 250 awards. It's completely merit-based. So
Hmm.
the kids that are winning these things are rock stars. They are the kid that wins the national science fair,
Hmm.
or the kid that's really high up in debate,
Hmm.
or whatever it might be. And they're the types of kids that are also going to the Ivy League or Stanford or Northwestern. Now, if you have that type of student, well, by all means, go for it.
Yeah.
But I think understanding what types of scholarships will work for you, at the colleges themselves, et cetera, and then focusing the ones where you have a likely opportunity of actually winning, I think is an important piece of that
Hmm.
puzzle. And then, of course, when we mentioned earlier, start early.
Hmm.
I had a family apply to 39 scholarships, and they won 7 for a total of $41,000.
Yeah. I mean,
How long does it
that's
take to do 41 scholarship applications?
right. It takes
That's
time. Yeah, no, it's
that wasn't
definitely
one Sunday afternoon.
no.
That was many Sunday afternoons. And
Yeah.
hopefully the parents helped, and the parents can help, but hopefully they didn't write the essays. They didn't, do the things that the student was supposed to do,
Hmm.
but they could help find the scholarships and stay organized and track the deadlines and make sure the right stuff goes to the right place at the right time. And that's where I've seen success as well, is when the parents are involved.
Hmm.
If your idea of getting scholarships is every time your student turns up Saturday morning or Saturday afternoon for breakfast, you say, hey, how are those scholarships coming? There's a good chance it's not going to work,
Not going to happen.
especially if you're middle income or upper middle income,
Hmm.
because, most kids, and depending, at the typical high school, right, and who's around them, if there's a general expectation that everybody's going to college, they don't really, they don't feel the need,
Hmm.
to figure out how to pay for it. They don't, et cetera. And again, there's some really driven kids who don't have the financial resources at home. They're the ones that buckle down and say, well, if I want to make this happen, I've got to make it happen. And
Yeah.
those kids often are more likely, and with some guidance from the parents or another mentor, can make a big difference.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned like it's not going to be just checking in, but like I do remember spending a couple hours a week on this type of work for a while. Yeah.
Right.
And I think if you think about like that family, $41,000, that could be somebody's full-time job,
Oh,
is what they make in a year. So I think it's kind of it's good to think about these things, especially maybe if you're right, if there is the Coca-Cola scholarships that everyone's going to go for, or there's the local ones where there's not very many people even applying or trying, those odds might be good. And maybe if it is 3,000 here or 5,000 there, it might not seem substantial, but add them up. And that's pretty helpful, especially, especially if see them in your local paper or your community that is a
Right.
pretty good place to start. What are some other unconventional strategies or things that people could think about when it comes to lowering the cost of college in general? Maybe not getting the scholarships, but are there any things that people could think about? Because most of the time we think about what happened for us. We look at our own experience, where we went, what we did. What are some things that people can think about that might be a little bit different than their experience that can help them save in this area?
Right. Well, I think it helps to divide it into kind of two-step process. So
Hmm.
the first step is to find a school at a reasonable price, whatever that means.
Yeah.
So, this private school started at 75,000, but we've got a merit scholarship and a need-based scholarship. So now it's 30,000.
Hmm.
And then the next step is how do we pay that price
Hmm.
efficiently? So now we're looking at, making sure we get all the tax breaks that we can get. Let's focus on saving and investing as much as we can, as early as we can. Let's work at, picking the right loans if we're going to fill the gaps with loans. And I think a lot of times, and just again, some things, well, you save 1,000 here, you save 1,000 there, and all of a sudden it adds up to real money. Most of the time, it's not going to be very easy.
Hmm.
Generally, college is going to be painful for most families.
Hmm.
And that's kind of by design, because if you think about how need-based aid works is, well, this aid is available if you need it. Well, how do you know you need it? Well,
Hmm.
because it's going to be too painful, we're going to
Hmm.
take a little bit of the pain away, but they don't want to hand it out to families
Yeah.
where they don't quite need it.
Yes.
So families that have learned to spend every penny they make and then they roll into college, that they're the ones that really feel the shock.
Yeah. I've
But
heard
if,
that,
right,
this we get hit the hardest and we're right here in that middle, like you mentioned with Stanford with that 100,000. And then the people who are kind of in between there might not feel like they have a lot of money, but they might not be the ones getting substantial amounts of aid. So I think that is where, yeah, the planning ahead, even if you start funding college or saving for college, investing for college, obviously the earlier you can with any investment, the better. When you
right,
have time on your side, you can do more with less. But I think that is important for people to think about. And also, when it comes to student loans, do you have any thoughts there when it comes to, when people are looking at different types of loans, say they didn't get a lot of aid and they didn't get everything, and they're trying to figure out a way to send their kid to school like next year. Um, it doesn't seem like student loan forgiveness or anything like that is going to be anytime in the near future. I don't think that that's something that people can really plan on. But what
right,
are your thoughts there when it comes to, looking for loans and any basic tips for people who might have to go that direction?
right. Well, the first thing to realize is the typical 18-year-old that's rolling out of high school and going off to college can only borrow 5,500 their freshman year by
Mhm.
themselves in their own name. So that's the direct loan. And that's a loan to the student. It's paid back by the student. Mom and dad are not involved.
Mhm.
But after that, mom and dad are completely involved because the next loan that the federal government offers is the plus loan, which is a loan to the parents, paid back by the parents. The
Mhm.
student's not involved. So the good news about the plus loan is that it will always fill the gap because the maximum loan for the parents is cost of attendance minus any other aid. So if you're looking at Harvard, you don't get any aid at all. Parents could borrow all 90,000 and cover the whole cost. Now, I'm not saying they should, I'm saying they could. And in a lot of cases, those loans are not real strict on how they award the money. So a lot of families can get themselves in over their head because they're,
It's not looking at your ability to pay it back so much, right?
exactly. They don't look at the ability to pay it back. They just say, this loan will cover everything.
Hmm.
Now, so I think that's where, again, a lot of parents that are panicking is they didn't do the job well. Now they're saying, well, these are the schools we get to pick from, and they're all expensive, and we have no choice but to sign up for the loan.
Hmm.
Um, and then there's also the private loan market where you can go get a student loan where mom and dad typically are co-signing, and the student is on the loan as well. Once you get to the private market, now it's, buyer beware. Make sure you understand the terms and conditions because they're all different, right? It's like a boat loan or a car loan, right? Some are this many years, that many years. Some you defer payments, some you start paying right away. There's all kinds of different options. And for families with really strong credit, you might be able to get a loan that's better than the federal loans by going to the private market. And if your credit is relatively weak, then this government loans will most likely look better. And then, of course, there's lots of people that, student loan, along with all the other interest rates, spiked. So, right, kids in college today are borrowing at 6.5% on their loan, and the parent loan is at 9%, which, the math is a lot uglier at those kind of interest rates than way back when it was 5 and 6%.
Sure.
So a lot of parents will say, well, I can borrow money so much cheaper here or there. And it's like, yeah, well, then maybe that might be the way to go. Maybe a home equity line of credit or refinancing might be something to consider. Now, again, there's pros and cons to every one of these paths. My caution is don't borrow a ton of money unless you have an understanding of what you're getting into, especially if it's like, well, I've got, 4 or 5 really good quality options that's much more affordable, and I want to borrow a bunch of money to go to this, the Cadillac on this list, or I want to splurge on the better school. That's a big caution. On the other side of that, taking loans as a way to actually get the education done for a kid that's going to go off and do great things is probably worth it almost, again, at a reasonable price.
Yeah.
If that's what you need to do. So I think they're a great tool to fill the gaps and get the education complete for families that need them. I think they can get abused where now we're, spending the money to go to our dream school or whatever that might mean, that maybe we shouldn't spend the money on.
I think it's interesting. I remember speaking with somebody when it came to college planning, and they said that the weather on the day of the college visit had more of an impact of people's decision making than the price.
Yes.
So I think we need to be very strategic about this. We have to really look at this as a big, investment, not just this natural, kind of this part of life, or it's really important. And I think that some of the families I talked to, or some of the individuals I talked to on the other side of college, would have done things differently based on now how much they're paying in their student loan payment. That's kind of delaying them being able to do much, else in their life as a young adult. So I think it's such an important thing for people to think about. Are you seeing any shifts as far as, with one thing I noticed when I've talked to some families is there's, one said that I asked how their kid did in school and their standardized tests and things like that. They said they weren't going to report them. Are things changing as far as what schools are looking at when it comes to, deciding on who they accept at the school? And are certain things becoming more important or less important when it comes to kind of preparing to get actually accepted?
Right. Yeah, there's been a lot of change around testing. So with COVID, it was nearly impossible for students to actually take a test because everything was shut down. So colleges had no choice but to say, well, we'll accept students without a test because otherwise, that they would have no customers. And obviously that isn't going to
work. Bad for business, yes.
Some colleges realized that things worked out just fine without test scores. So they're going to continue with that. And this isn't new. There, some colleges were test optional before COVID, but it greatly accelerated it to many more colleges. Now what we're seeing is some colleges are saying, okay, we were test optional. It's not working for us. We're going to go back and start requiring the tests, starting in 2025 or 2026. And then of course, some colleges never said we're stopping the testing. So it's a mixed bag. And I think a good way to think about it is a typical college doesn't look at one thing when they're trying to determine if you're a student for them, right? They look at your grades, the type of courses you took. They look at your test scores if you provide them. They look at your essays, your extracurriculars. They try and do a multi-point evaluation. Well, if there's 10 things that they look at and now they're test optional, now there's 9 things they look at. Some families out there where the kids are strong test takers, are unhappy that tests don't, aren't in the mix. And families where their kids are weak test takers say, well, it's great. We don't have to stress about it. So it's different. And now you need to think about it a little bit more. In the past, it was like, well, we have to take the test. We have to do well because every college on the list requires it. Now it's, if, maybe you build a list that is test optional, or maybe you kind of wait and see. But again, there's lots of things to think through on all this. And then again, that's why we want to start planning early. That's not, it's one little piece of the puzzle of what do we plan on doing around testing. And that's something you need to work out junior year, ideally, because you're going to take those tests throughout the junior year and hopefully not, have to push that into the senior year because you've got a lot of other things to do senior year, actual applications, et cetera. So I think that's one big change. Another big change that's been rocking the college world right now is the FAFSA has been changing and it has been delayed. So by the time you're hearing this, it should be open this year, but originally they used to turn it on every October 1st. The past 2 years, they didn't make it till October 1st. They were delayed until into December. So that has made a kind of a crunch for the colleges, and it's been a little more challenging for families. I mean, the bad news is it's been delayed. The good news is everybody's in the same boat. So the colleges can't really penalize you for being late because, there's no way for anyone to actually do it. And there was workarounds and it just got stressful and complicated. Hopefully this is
delaying
the
when
last
people
year.
can make their decisions, right? Because they don't really know. Yeah. So that is something, unfortunately, that universally across the board. But do you think it's important for everyone to fill out the FAFSA?
I would say yes. Either you fill out the FAFSA or you figure out that you really don't need to. Now, figuring out whether you need to fill it out or not is probably more work than just filling it out.
Right. That's what I was thinking. But if you're not super sure about that, fill it out.
Right. I mean, in order to qualify for the federal loans, you have to fill out the FAFSA. In order to qualify for need-based aid at many schools, you have to do the FAFSA. Now, there's some families that are saying, well, we're going to pay full price. We're just going to write a check. We can afford it. Okay, well, fine. You may not qualify for some scholarships if you don't apply for need-based aid. So, but if you check all the boxes and you look it over and you decide you don't want to do it, well, that's fine. You don't have to. But like it's not that hard.
Yeah.
And for most families, it's probably just simpler to just do it.
That makes sense. So that wrapping up, I know it's such an important decision. It's something that a lot of people are thinking about. So what would be your one piece of advice for people or for families if they're really feeling overwhelmed at this point? What do you think is the best thing that they could do to kind of maybe ease the process or make it a little bit less painful to go about this with their families?
Right. Well, as we've already mentioned a few times already, start early. Start in the junior year, start in the sophomore year. Realize that if you've got a more complicated life, if you've, blended families, divorce, inheritances, small businesses, where your life is a little more complicated, or you have a student that's talking about, going to California or maybe Texas or maybe Boston, and they're that kind of kid that's going to be, traveling all over the country looking at colleges. When you hear that kind of stuff, it's like, oh, that means I've got more work to do than average. So I should start earlier. So I guess that's probably the key is, start early. And then it's also a process. You don't sit down, again, and work it all out one weekend or something and say, all right, college plan is done. It's more of a process, right? You start figuring out need-based aid and merit aid, and you visit some schools and you trying to figure out, what we want to be when we grow up and trying to find a good match across everything. And then you might learn, based on those visits, these schools are in and those schools are out. Oh, things change. Now we got to figure out how these schools work and what are their prices and how. So it's a process that, like I said, start early, work through it. You got all the different testing, the scholarships, the visits, the research, all junior year, you can get started. And many families will do some visits even sophomore year.
Mhm.
Now they're just kind of a preliminary visit. They're a low pressure. You're not, trying to find the school that's perfect for you necessarily. You're just trying to show the student what a big school and a small school look like. So when you ask them that question of, do you like a big school? I mean, a typical 17-year-old, what do you mean big?
Yeah.
What,
It's very
can
hard
you
to
show me an
tell.
example of big?
Yeah.
Well, when you go to the flagship state school with 40,000 students, and it's huge compared to the little private school that's down the street. So there's, again, lots to do, and you got to squeeze it in. Most parents of high school kids are really busy, and it's just one more thing to do.
Yeah. No, and I think it's smart. I'll even talk to some families when they're going on a summer vacation or something. They might swing by a school or look at something even earlier, because you're right, it doesn't have to be a high pressure, tour visit. Sometimes you could just get a good feel or a good understanding, because it's hard to tell, you're right, like what a big school is when you're just used to your high school or you're just used to your community. So I think it's really important to do that. Parents, it's important to, stay engaged. Obviously, you can't be too hands off in this process. If there is that financial piece of it, that's going to be on your plate too. And trying to, strike that balance to help. And definitely planning ahead is such an important thing when it comes to any of our big financial goals. So that's always something that working with a CFP on can be very beneficial. So thank you, Brad, so much for joining us today. How can people reach out to you or learn more if they want to follow you or listen to some of your podcast or your material that you've shared?
Right. Yeah. So everything is at tamingthehighcostofcollege.com. So we've got a podcast there. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can, if you want to just, reach out, have a question, there's ways to do that on the website, all our free resources and blog. So there's lots of resources, it's a great place to just get your feet wet again. So I encourage families to, do what they can to get educated.
Awesome. Thank you. Yes, head over to the website, look at some of those resources. There's so many things that we can get our hands on, for free, or even just that information can be really helpful to kind of set us on the right track for, what we want to do, or even just kind of with all of the different questions about where to go, what to apply for, what to look for. Some of those things can be really helpful. So thank you so much, Brad, for coming on the show and sharing your resources. And if you're looking to see if college planning is in your financial future and you're looking to work with me, please head over to mistylynch.com. I'd love to chat with you about some of your financial goals and see how we can all help kind of tame that cost of college. Thank you all so much for listening, and we'll talk again next week. Don't forget to share with friends and family, and together let's demystify the world of money. Knowledge is the key to financial empowerment.